Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you back to another episode of Learning with My Rabbis. I'm very excited today. We have Rabbi Adam Schaffer, who's Director of Education for Temple Aliyah in Woodland Hills, California. It's actually the synagogue that I interned in rabbinical school. But I met Rabbi Schaffer years before, working at Camp Ramah and in other capacities. I got to know him and his family quite well, and he was always there as a resource for me when I was a rabbinical student. So I'm very excited, Rabbi, to have you with us and to share you with my community here in Toronto. Welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you here as a colleague.
So I want to jump in with just sharing a little bit of your story, maybe with my community. What is it that led you to the rabbinate?
Well, in a lot of ways, I often joke that the reason I got led to the rabbinate is for the purest of reasons of all, and that's that I was really interested in a cute girl. And I jokingly say that because it's one of those butterfly effect stories. Long story short, I used to say to myself that I really enjoyed being Jewish in spite of the upbringing I had, not so much because of it. I really was not that enamored with the congregation where I grew up. It seemed very sterile, it seemed very distant, it seemed very cold. It was one of those classical reform and classically classical reform relics from earlier in the century, complete with organ and choir and all those things. And it never really resonated with me as a kid growing up in the 80s. I happened in the summer of 88 to be going away to sleepaway camp, and I met a girl who I ended up dating for over a year and a half. And in the process of our dating, she got me to join our regional chapter of NIFTY. And as I absolutely fell in love, not only with her, but also with the youth group experience. And I saw in this youth group a whole different kind of Jewish upbringing, a whole different kind of Jewish outlook, and a whole different way of being Jewish that I just hadn't seen either in my own home or anywhere else. And as I delved deeper into youth group, I found I was enjoying it more. I found that I not only enjoyed the social aspect that every kid seems to enjoy, but also so much of the learning about Judaism. And I came to learn and meet rabbis who were other than the people who were in my congregation on the Bima. And it's not that they weren't good Bima rabbis, they were actually great. And while I was never a fan of the congregation, the rabbis themselves were always wonderful with me, but they had always seemed like distant, much older people. They weren't relatable the same way. So here I was getting to meet all these different people who were closer to my age. They were peers, they were willing to sit down and have difficult and interesting discussions with me. And I got bit by the bug. And in many ways, I came to realize that I would love to do what they were doing, to work with people to help make Judaism meaningful for them. And I came to see the job really for what it is, which was an amalgamation of the many different skills that I was already developing and enjoying. I loved singing as a kid. I loved teaching as a kid. I loved connecting with people. I loved doing Jewish. I loved doing spiritual things. I loved being a counselor with, at that point, was just my friends, but I was often the person that people came to for that kind of advice. So when you look at the kind of things that a rabbi does, there's very few jobs that can roll all those things into one. And so it seemed a very natural choice for me, ultimately, by the time I went through college, to go down that road. I made sure after college to work in the Jewish community for a few years to make certain that I wasn't just coming up with some romanticized notion. I wanted to actually see what it looked like to get dirty in the trenches. But after 4 years of doing that, I was pretty well convinced, and I ended up in rabbinic school.
Great. I think that story, actually, it's fascinating. I think it resonates very deeply with me too, that a lot of my Jewish experiences, and I loved my synagogue actually growing up, but it was only after I went and got involved at summer camp and youth group and these other places and had the sense of Jewish community that the synagogue then kind of made more sense. But it's that those informal experiences, we've talked about that on the show before with other guests, they have some power with youth that just really, it's hard to capture in the formal synagogue setting. And I can't quite put that into language and what that is. Rabbi Joe and I from Camp Ramah talked about this a little bit. And his thought was that you really can't recreate that magic of the summer camp experience at synagogue, that there's something about Shabbatic camp that as much as we try, we can never really come close to reproducing in our sanctuaries for teens, that it has to be in camp. Do you kind of feel the same way? I guess youth group is something that happens more on synagogues campuses.
Well, I think that Rabbi Joe is really onto something, but I think there's a little bit more to it than just that. We all know that there are certain things about camp specifically that are unique to the environment. It is completely isolated in a healthy way. It is its own bubble. It is a sealed environment where you can create the entire ecosystem. So services or whatever you do Jewishly is just part of the package, whereas synagogues, by their very definition, are but one aspect of what everyone else is doing with their life. The synagogue can't create hermetically sealed lives for people. I mean, if you think about it, when you look at the ultra-Orthodox community, that's where, on the reverse extreme, they kind of capture what camp does, because they truly do live, if you're in the genuinely ultra-Orthodox world, in their own little hermetically sealed bubble. And in that place, synagogue is just a natural extension of what you would be looking for in the world and in life, in much the way that you can do it in a camping world. But the other side of it is that camp is also an isolated world because it's dedicated for the campers and counselors almost exclusively, whereas a synagogue as an institution is responsible for its entire cradle-to-grave population. And that's not a problem necessarily, it just reflects two different realities. A synagogue is often, when you look at the services that happen, is really gearing itself to the entire population, to whatever works for as many different people as possible. But that often means that you're gearing your religious experiences towards a large center, but that kids and elderly and other different demographics often get left out of that. It sort of hits a good middle, but doesn't get to a lot of different people. And that's really what I remember about my synagogue experience as a kid was, boy, there's no one else my age around. And that's with good reason, because the experience isn't geared to me as a child. You can't teach teens same way you would teach 40-year-olds. You wouldn't want to do it in regular school, and you certainly don't want to do it from a synagogue experience. So with those two things combined, I think you see why it's much more difficult to create that kind of aspect, and why synagogue movements were smart to really have these moments created by youth group and camp that allow their teens to work in isolation from one another. Teens naturally need that environment anyway before you end up in the Jewish territory. They need places where they can work with their peers in safe spaces, to grow safely, to ask challenging questions, and to be the lead on things as opposed to being the kid on things. So youth groups and camps really provide them a great living laboratory to do it.
Wow. I love that, because I think this is why we needed a professional educator on the show, because you were able to put words to that sense of what's special about these places, of what it is that's going on there. You mentioned before, when you talked about your background, you grew up in that kind of classical Reform synagogue, and you went to NIFTY, you were involved in the Reform youth group, and you went to Hebrew Union College. It's where you have your ordination from one of the Reform rabbinical schools. And you're working now in a conservative setting. So I think you have a unique viewpoint of, we've talked a lot on the show about what the differences are between the between the conservative and the Orthodox world, and where that border lies. But where do you see the border kind of between the Reform and the conservative world? Where does that, 'cause I think that one's a little harder maybe to put our fingers on, when a lot of times the congregants in both congregations would appear very similar in terms of practice.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because the movements mean different things to different people. I mean, I think it's insightful that you start with the idea that the congregants are often very similar between the conservative and reform movement. And the irony is that when you talk to the leaderships, if we were to talk only to a room full of rabbis and have no congregants in the discussion whatsoever, or even if you weren't talking to them, if you just had a room full of rabbis and talked to whose practices look similar, people would say that the conservative rabbis and Orthodox rabbis' practices are fairly similar because they're both halachic movements. They have a different take on halacha as to what can and can't be updated and where modernity plays, but they're both at least halachic movements. But that's really only at the top levels. I mean, it is an old joke among my conservative colleagues, which is the only reason why I feel somewhat safe sharing it here, is that there's a running joke that there are truly only three types of Jews in the world, that there are Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, and conservative rabbis. Which is to say that the conservative rabbinate is in this amazing and wonderful place of being committed both to halacha and to modernity and all the things that come with it. But the reality is the laity on the ground often tend to skew towards one side or the other much more. That on the Orthodox world, there's an overall much greater commitment to halacha, granted with many different variations on how they include modernity. I don't want to overgeneralize Orthodoxy. And in the Reform movement, there is certainly a commitment to Jewish custom and law, but the commitment to autonomy and modernity is much, much stronger. And the reality is that when you look at the ground of where our congregants are, most of the people who are in either the Reform or the Conservative movement have a very similar looking praxis. It's very difficult to identify from what people do in their day-to-day life, whether they are a Reform or Conservative Jew, based on what they do outside of their own religious context. And frankly, sometimes even within their own religious context. The reality, as we all know, is that in both places, kashrut is not observed by the majority of people. And ironically, right now, kashrut is on the upswing in the Reform movement and also in the Conservative movement in certain other places. So it's becoming much more blurry from a congregational perspective to see where the lines really are. As you know, one of the to be very apropos of the moment, there's a lot of talk that people have been making that once the conservative movement allowed for Zoom services in the once the pandemic began, that you really couldn't see all that much of a difference, because one of the hallmarks that one could say in the past was that conservative synagogues would not use significant amounts of technology, certainly not computers, webcams, and encouraging their congregants to do so. But because of the true needs of the moment, you know, in halachic terms, the shadachak, but truly more just the understanding of what we need to do in order to be able to maintain our communities, people were willing to do it. It's just one more example of where the lines between modernity and halakha are harder and harder to discern. Now, if you look truly philosophically at where people are on paper, there still is a very significant difference. When you're talking about a commitment to a halachic process, the way the conservative movement does, with a board like the Committee for Jewish Law and Standards that ultimately has the authority to make decisions that to whatever degree possible are binding on the institutions for certain, the rabbis for absolute sure, and to a lesser extent the laity, no such body exists in the Reform movement. There is a movement that does issue she'elot and tshuvot, answers and questions, they answer she'elot, they answer questions and provide tshuvot, answers to those halakhic questions, but they have no real binding status. They're merely a guide, even more so than the CJLS does, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, where they can say, well, there's a minority opinion, a majority opinion, and you can kind of go in different directions. The Reform movement at best can offer guidance. And that's really in line with the idea that still at the core of the Reform movement is the notion that the individual has enough of a sense of autonomy to make his or her own decisions about the level of observance that they will or won't adopt. Whereas at a conservative movement, it's much more at an institutional communal level that kind of thing can happen. But I think what you're seeing is that the two movements, because of their proximity to each other on the spectrum and geographically, that many of the people work in the same fields, they influence each other. The conservative movement, I think, definitely influenced the Reform movement, certainly in the late 80s, early 90s, to become more observant in its nature and to appreciate ritual observance in a way that ritual hadn't been appreciated in the Reform movement for a long time. And I think the Reform movement has influenced the conservative movement in its application of Judaism as social justice, as an expression of Jewish tradition, and not just as a principle, but as an actual bona fide way of action. So I think that in a lot of ways, anytime you get two things that are on the ground that are that similar to one another, there's a lot of cross-fertilization.
It's been really interesting when I moved to Toronto, seeing a more traditional wing of the conservative movement, and also to the same degree the Reform movement here, in a way, are kind of, I don't say out of step, but they're distinct in a way, obviously connected, but what I saw in LA with reform and conservative synagogues and communities. But it is interesting to see that those differences even here play out in that way, even though they're about different issues and different levels. And I'm not actually sure how the reform movement here has responded to COVID and online services, but I know most of the conservative synagogues, or all of them, as far as I know, have been reluctant to go along with that Zoom ruling in terms of Shabbat usage. But on the other hand, live stream technology, which I saw as commonplace at a lot of synagogues in Los Angeles in the conservative movement, only now after what's happened with COVID has that been something that's really taken a large upswing, I think, in a lot of the conservative synagogues here, us included, where we've gotten that technology and been able to use it where it's not being actively monitored on Shabbat, but to offer our congregants a way to see what's going on in the building. Speaking a little bit about Zoom and COVID, it's one of the things that's been very difficult for us, and I think every synagogue, is try to figure out how do we put on engaging children's programs using these technologies when we can't interact in the same way with our young families as we would otherwise. Which is ironic because kids spend so many hours a day looking at a screen, but trying to get them to participate in the same service that works in person on a screen has been very difficult. And I'm just curious, in your own experience, if you had any successes or ideas there of what's the best way to really involve kids online.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note that I don't know too many places that have lately had tremendous success getting kids to attend their in-person services either. So it wasn't like the in-person, it wasn't as though the in-person piece was swelling with numbers and suddenly when it went to virtual, it all dissipated. So I think we have to acknowledge and be respectful of our own posture there too. But that said, I do think that the question of how we use the virtual environment is very important when it comes to looking at our children. We have to understand, and I think we're only very beginning to understand, what are the limitations of the environment and what are the advantages. Let's set aside for the moment just the question of halakha and how we use it, just to make life a little bit easier. Let's think about this only from the standpoint of, let's say we have the full capability of using Zoom to whatever extent you can. So, as any adult will tell you who's had to have their workplace move to a remote world, being on Zoom is an oddly tiring experience, even though we're not moving whatsoever. I think it's telling us as adults that there's something about the environment that is very different, that we are already seeing studies come out that the energy that it takes mentally to be scanning all the faces, to be participating, looking for visual cues, it seems imperceptible because it's just eye movement. But we all know the phrase Zoom fatigue now, and we know it not only scientifically, but anecdotally and personally and experientially. So we have to be able to pay attention to that aspect when we're dealing with it for children. Because if our attention spans and focus are being drained more quickly as adults, ala chat kama v'chama, all the more so when we're dealing with younger minds for kids. They're already going to be dealing with a smaller attention span, and we have to be able to respond accordingly. In a classroom environment, a standard classroom, in-person environment, we try to tell teachers that they should switch tactics after a minimum of 20 minutes, that one should never try to just go through the same mode of expression or instruction for longer than that. They don't always heed the advice, mind you, but that's generally the best practice. And on Zoom, we've often said we have to cut that in half, that you really need, in order to make something work, to switch modalities in some way after 10 minutes or so. Now, that doesn't mean you have to give up the topic. It doesn't mean you can only stay on one thing, but it means that you might need to shift from a story into a game, into a play, into something else, just to keep that particular piece fresh. And that's what allows kids to be able to stick around and to absorb the different messages. Mind you, I'm not sure it's such a bad thing to think about it that way for adults, that oftentimes the critique of our worship in general is that it seems too staid, that we stay on the same thing in the same mode for too long, that it could be helpful to try to find ways, even when we go back to being in person, to mixing things up a little bit more while at the same time maintaining a consistent flow throughout the process. So I think that's part of the aspect. Some of the other things, though, are trying to look at what does Zoom provide you that an in-person element doesn't? And I think those are things that we're just beginning to tap into. What are things that we never had the chance to do before that because we're on Zoom, we now can do? Some of those things are mild and structural, and we don't think about them as big deals. But for example, right now, if I have to run my religious school on Zoom this fall, I don't need to be limited to the same teachers that I had in my physical school. They're great teachers. I'm not, for the record, and should anyone Temple Aliyah see this does not mean I'm abandoning all my teachers. It just means that if there's a great person who lives in Chicago that wants to teach in my Zoom room, they can. And it's no big deal. There's no difference to my teacher who lives in Woodland Hills, California, around the corner from my students doing the teaching, than it is to someone who is in Chicago or New York or Jerusalem. The only thing standing in the way is time zones. We've seen a lot of really great reconnected pieces because the geographical bounds have been broken down. And I think that some of that will come into play when we look at how we work with our kids going forward. We may be able to open a lot more Jewish education to people who don't necessarily live in the center of town, or for that matter, anywhere near Jewish centers of education that we've never thought about. If you're at a place like Chat right now in Toronto, do you think about the possibility that maybe you could have a blended academy one day where you would have people living in Toronto who could go to the school in person, but people who might join you from the hinterlands of the Yukon Territory because they got thrown up there for some kind of military assignment, but they happen to be Jewish. And guess what? Now their kids and their family can be part of your Jewish high school, as can people in other cities where they don't have as robust an infrastructure Jewishly, or where they don't have enough of a critical mass to do a high school. Those are the kind of things at a macro level. And at a micro level, I wonder if we can't look at those things too. What else can we open doors to on Zoom that we never thought of doing before, that now we can?
It's great in that way to think about the long-term impact as not just negative, but it has all of these positives. I mean, this conversation, being able to share you with my community here in Toronto, right? That's the result of Zoom and this new ability to bring people in, which it really is a treat. As we're looking toward, please.
Well, it's important to note that it's the pandemic that brought the Zoom phenomenon to prominence, but Zoom was here and people were using it. You and I were probably on any number of Zoom meetings long before it became the preferred way of doing business. So all we're doing now is, now that it's become a global phenomenon, we're trying to say, what else could it do besides just connect people for remote meetings?
No, absolutely. It's great. And seeing the way this technology can be used for such a diverse way. It's something we're struggling with now as we're looking towards the high holidays. Or what are going to be the best ways to connect people to do some type of a service? And I'm sure it's similar discussions are happening at Temple Aliyah and really at every synagogue, not just in North America, but around the world, or what are going to be the best ways to use online technologies, whether it's live, whether they're recorded videos, whether it's a mix of in-person. How are we going to do that? I want to go back to broader now than just COVID. One of the things I loved when I was teaching at the synagogue, when I was interning, I got to teach forgetting now the name of the group, Shevet Achim. It was a group for young men about learning to be Jewish men and leaders and role models in the world. And there's a similar group for the teen girls, the young women, for them to participate in. And what was great in that class is we got to talk about a lot of things with these teens that you wouldn't typically hear, I think, in religious school. A lot of topics that I never had about what it means to be a man in the world, and masculinity, and all these other things. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is what are the topics that we're teaching our kids, and how do we choose what's in the conversation? I think particularly Israel is a hot topic of how do we choose kind of what are the borders? What is okay to discuss in a synagogue setting or in a religious school or a summer camp about Israel versus what opinions are beyond the pale and we're just not going to teach? how do you as an educator, as a director of an education center, choose and discuss with your staff what is okay and what isn't?
Well, it's an interesting question to look at from two different levels. Because I'm primarily dealing with elementary age students, I have kids basically from kindergarten all the way through grade 6, maybe grade 7 on a given time. The answers to that question are a little bit different for that age range as compared to what I might do with teens. And a lot of that is simply that I feel like we need to lay a good foundation about where Israel is in people's life at a young age. I want them to develop as many of the emotional attachments as we can so that they feel a connection to and ideally a love for Israel before they really get into the hard and difficult pieces about it. I think that the challenge is that when you talk about the level of difficulty of the Israel conversation, it exists mostly on a much higher level than a third grader is going to be able to understand. I can't imagine in the third grade, which is where we happen to focus mostly on Israel, being able to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, being able to address annexation, being able to address all of those particular things, let alone the criticisms of those movements, because it's hard enough for them to understand the geography and the politics. They're just trying to figure out what are the 4 or 5 countries that border Israel, and if they can know that, I'm very happy. So I think it's important to understand that at a base level, I feel like the kinds of topics that I want in the discussion at a given moment on the early side are more, for lack of a better term, wholesome. They're more of the easy ones to be able to lay the ground with. But as kids get older, into middle school and certainly into high school, I feel like it's important to be able to expose them to a very wide spectrum of what people say about Israel, running all the way from the right to the people who believe that Israel should have the most expansionist policies whatsoever, pretty much all the way to the left to the people who are dealing with the BDS world. Now, that doesn't mean that I teach the BDS world because I want my kids to believe in the BDS world. I want my kids simply to know that such things are out there so that they can answer those questions when they are inevitably confronted with them after they leave the 4 walls of my institution. They are going to be confronted with a very wide world of Israel policies, Israel criticisms, Israel statements, Israel points of view, and I want them to know what people are saying and thinking. You know, people often talk to me about being a rabbi on social media, and I think about this not just in the social media world, and not just in the Israel world, but even in the broader perspective. I make it my business to read news sources that go outside of my echo chamber. I make it a point of every day to read several different sources on the left and several different sources on the right. And I want to do that because I have congregants who meet the ideological spectrum all over, and I don't want to go and rehash just the same old talking past each other points that we often end up in. I want to be able to talk to them about the arguments that they are hearing and be well versed in them. So I feel like I want my kids in religious schools to be able, in the perfect world, to be able to do the same thing when they get out. They're going to form their opinions ultimately based on what they see in the world and how they interact. And I want them to have had my imprint of where all of those things fall when they encounter it as a result.
That's a great answer. I remember when I first went to, not college, here we call it university. I learned there's a difference. But when I first went to university, it was the first time I really heard a lot of anti-Israel rhetoric and a lot of accusations against the IDF, against the idea of Zionism and all of this. And I remember it was really traumatic for me in a lot of ways because I'd got none of this at summer camp and youth group and my Hebrew school experience as a kid or Hebrew high school, any of that. And I remember I spent a lot of time my first year talking with a couple of Israeli professors, our Israel educator at Hillel, and reading a lot of books and spending a lot of time on YouTube. But I know a lot of my friends, they really felt in a way lied to by their Jewish education because they started to question everything because all they had ever heard was how great Israel was. So when they were presented with moments when Israel was perhaps deserving of criticism, it really shattered that whole image, and everything else then that they had learned about Israel fell into question. So I think it's a great approach. How do you decide kind of what age is appropriate to start having those conversations? I mean, you have now two teenagers of your own, or an almost teenager and a teen. So how do you decide what age as a parent / educator that you would want to start having those discussions?
I think it's challenging to figure that one out because it is really different for every child. I mean, in my perfect world, I'd be able to adjust it to each individual kid and know when he or she was ready to be able to tackle the conversation. But broadly speaking, I tend to think as a good template, which can be adjusted a little bit either way. I think that by the time you get to 8th grade, 9th grade, those kind of things need to at least be introduced. That people need to be able to start to hear about things beyond their little bubble. You know, I think that that's salient and significant because developmentally, it's at the point when kids start to challenge things naturally anyway. There's nothing more age appropriate for a teenager than to challenge the system of the authority that they're being handed. And I think that part of the struggle we have as not only Jewish educators, but not only Jewish educators about Israel, but really Jewish educators about everything, is that if we don't give these kids a robust, good system full of answers when they hit that moment, then they will drop everything that they've had from before then. It's not just about Israel. Like when you talk about the experience you had about thinking about how you hadn't learned any of these truths about the IDF or Israel as an occupier or any of those things, that you began to question all of what you'd learned about Israel as a kid. Well, that's true when people encounter evolution or when people encounter things that run against the mythology that we teach them as children. And I think we forget that sometimes the way we layer Bible even carries such this magnificent mythological weight that it's almost presented as though it were the gospel truth. I don't think we necessarily mean it that way, and certainly many of the people who are teaching it don't think of it that way. But because of the way that we naturally express it to our kids when they're young, when they're at that wonderfully impressionable age, when they're story driven, that when they then get when the myth gets shattered, whether that's because they learn about science or they learn about politics or they learn about whatever it is, or they learn about the way that the world is much more complicated and messy than religious stories present them to be they about the creation of the universe or the creation of the state of Israel, then they go, well, wait a minute, I guess that's no good anymore. I now have the more advanced feature. And we don't do them the service of saying, as Rabbi Harold Schulweis, one of my great teachers, Alav HaShalom, would say, that we forget to tell kids that what we're teaching them wasn't meant to be history. What we're teaching them wasn't meant to be science. What we were teaching them was statements about how to live in the world. That the stories we learn in Torah are not about how the world came to be. They're really about why the world came to be and what are the repercussions from it. If you understand that you're not going to be able to teach that as a child. You can't teach a third grader that the story in Genesis is really about why the world came to be. They're barely able to comprehend the why question at that point, at that deeper level. But if you don't then bring that up at 8th grade, you're going to run into problems when they run into Darwin in high school. And so the same thing goes for Israel. If you only leave them with a third grader's understanding, it's not going to be a big surprise that when someone in college presents them a college level argument that seems to really strip away all the third grade level stuff they know, that they're going to feel there's nothing left. You need to be able to build on what they have and give them a much richer understanding of anything Jewish, Israel or otherwise, in order for them to really remain solid adult Jewish citizens in the world.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I remember also in university, I took my first year Hebrew Bible class thinking it would be easy. And I remember the very first day the teacher asked the first question I ever had in university was, why are there two different names of God used in the book of Genesis? And I raised my hand and I said, one represents God's mercy and the other God's rule of law, God's just attribute of justice, which is Rashi's answer. And then was explained about two different authors and JED and P and different documents. And it really was a very shattering, traumatic moment for me. The teacher, Dr. Devorah Schoenfeld, actually is an Orthodox Jew. And after class, she sat with me for a while to help me understand academic versus religious beliefs and how she lives in that world of both. But it definitely, for me, was a big shock to the system that I think I would have been a lot better off and prepared for had those kinds of discussions come up earlier. A final question about this, just a short one, is actually I had recently on Shabbat, a congregant came up to me to ask their grandson, 8 or 9, asked them how God was born. And my response as a philosopher was I could send you all sorts of documents and ideas about, right, the prime mover and the first cause and all of that. And even we could look towards the Big Bang and all that. But I suggested that he ask just to simply, the answer be a question, how do you think? And I'm just curious with your own experience, right, what would you answer to a young child that's asking those kinds of questions? I know Rabbi Schulweis was big about getting to the real question behind the question. So I'm curious what you think might be that question behind that.
Well, with an 8 or 9-year-old, it's a fascinating age developmentally to think about it, because they're not quite at the wistful age of 5 or 6 where they're just beginning to understand how the world works, but they're not yet to the age of teens where they can think abstractly all that much. So it's very tricky to answer. Like, to be honest, I would have probably gone with your instinct. Anytime a child asks me a question about that, I'm always inclined to say, what do you think first? Because they usually have some ideas, and part of what they're asking me as a rabbi about is, or as a parent, if it's a parent, is they're trying to see whether the idea that's in their head but isn't yet able to be expressed, or they're not comfortable expressing it even if they know how, whether that measures up to what the adult says, whether what the authority says. So I usually like to do what you do, to let them and give them permission to express their idea and not have to have it measure up to what I think first. Once we hear that, I can then bounce off a little idea and say, well, what do you think about this possibility? Or what do you think about that possibility? Or, ooh, that sounds really cool. I never thought of it that way, the way you're bringing it up. If I weren't that open, I would still try to think of things just in a little bit more of a concrete level. I would say that when you talk about being born, the word you're using, we're already starting to think of something as though God were a person. We know that every person who's in this world and every animal that's in this world was born in some way, shape, or form to 2 parents, a mommy and a daddy, in some way, shape, or form. But it's important for us to remember that God isn't a person. While we often talk about God as having some human things and human attributes, I wouldn't even use the word attributes with an 8-year-old, but some human characteristics, that we can't try to think of God the same way as having had parents who gave birth. It's really different, and that's why it's hard to answer your question, because since it's not a person, we don't think of it the same way. It's hard, and it's even hard to think about what might have made God, because we don't know how God could possibly be made. And I would also let the kid know that it really is one of the great mysteries. No one knows for sure. People have been trying to think about this for hundreds and thousands of years, and no one has the right answer. We can all take a good guess, but no one knows what the right answer is.
I love that. This is why I think every rabbi needs an educational background and should be a required part of rabbinical school, because from teaching young kids to adults, education is such a big part of what we do. So it's really a pleasure to get to have an educator with us. The final question I've been asking everyone on the show is there a piece of Torah that's been significant to you in your life, something that you've been thinking about lately or for a long time that you'd like that you could share with us on any topic of your choosing?
Sure. I actually wanted to pull this up on screen because I think it'll be a little bit easier for people to follow along. I believe you guys have a pretty robust Melton program in Toronto, correct?
It's a great question, and I'm unsure on that. We don't have one at our synagogue. I don't know what it's like in the larger community.
Okay. I'm blessed to be part of the Melton School for Adults here in Los Angeles in 2 different campuses. And through it, I get to teach a whole bunch of different Jewish texts on a wide variety of topics. And I always tell people when I come to this one, when I first learned it actually as a teacher in the Melton program, that it kind of instantly became my favorite text of all time just because of its richness. There's a story that's written here in Makot, and let me zoom in on this so that it shows up on people's small screens a little bit better. Okay. So it says here at the top, starting here at the bold part, with regard to what scenario is the verse speaking, it actually doesn't matter in this case what the verse is, it's the story that's significant. It is with regard to 2 people who killed a person, where one of them killed unintentionally while the other killed intentionally. And the only thing I should mention about this is that The background is that these two people who killed were actually out supposedly in the middle of the desert where no one was around. And therefore it says, for this person, i.e. the first one, there were no witnesses to his action. And for that person, i.e. the second person, there are also no witnesses to his action. And therefore, neither received the appropriate punishment of exile and execution, respectively. The background, of course, is we need to remember that according to Torah, if you kill someone intentionally, and you can be convicted by the testimony of two witnesses, you're supposed to be sentenced to death. And someone who killed unintentionally is supposed to, upon the testimony of the appropriate witnesses, be sent off to a city of refuge. But because both of these people did their killing in the presence of absolutely no one, there's no witnesses therefore, and they get no punishment whatsoever. So the story continues. The Holy One, blessed be God, summons them to one inn. This person, i.e. the first person who killed intentionally, comes and sits beneath a ladder, and that person, i.e. the one who killed unintentionally, descends the ladder, and he falls upon him and kills him. Because it's in a tavern, there were witnesses to that incident, and therefore, that person, the one who killed intentionally, gets killed, and that person who killed unintentionally is exiled, each receiving what he deserved. So, when most people encounter this text at first, they see it as, oh, this is God's way of making sure that everyone gets the punishment that they should have gotten. That even if you escape human witness, you'll ultimately, God will give you your just deserts no matter what happens. The person who killed out in the middle of nowhere ultimately gets the punishment they should have gotten. They get killed, albeit by having someone land on them from falling off a ladder. And the person who unintentionally gets killed will do it again in the sight of witnesses this time, and therefore get the appropriate punishment. Now, what I try to remind people of is you could stop there and it would be a very simple and elegant teaching. You could say that this is the rabbi's way of saying God gives people what they ultimately deserve, even if we never get to see it happen.
It's like Jewish karma.
Exactly. It is truly just you could leave it there and say it's a great Jewish karma text. But I remind people that I don't think it's at all an accident that the rabbis made the scene in which the second killings happen be in a bar. Because I want you to think about what it would be like not to be the reader of the text where you see the entire story laid out before your eyes, but rather what would it be like to be a patron in the bar who watched the second killings? And in point of fact, if you were just sitting on the bar stool and watched person number 2 climb the ladder, slip off it, fall down, and land on person 1, killing him, your sentiments toward that person who died are going to be like, oh man, that's awful. What a shame. This guy just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he dies this horrible, tragic death. We actually end up, if you're the person in the bar, feeling horribly sorry for that person. When in point of fact, that's the person who committed the intentional murder on the outside. When you stand back and look at the larger picture, we're supposed to look at that guy underneath the ladder and go, huh, you got what you deserved. But if you're in the bar, you're going to look at it and go, oh my God, that's the last thing you wanted. You totally didn't deserve this. This is going to be awful. And it really points to the way that the line I like to leave people with when I teach it is, it's an understanding that for me, I think the rabbis, whether they realized or not, were telling us that the world in which, the walls of that tavern in which people are sitting are like the years in which we live our lives. That we can only know what we see and experience in a lifetime. We cannot possibly fully understand the larger picture of what's going to happen over the arc of the universe. We can and do have enough of an understanding that we can play a role and try to do what we can to make the world a better place. But we always have to be aware of both our ability to see this giant big picture as though we were looking at it from outside the text, and also the very narrow, limited view that we have by being human beings who only get to live 80, 90 years at best. That there's so much about what people, quote, deserve or don't deserve that we think we know because of what we see. And we need to remain open to the possibility that we only see a very small picture of it. And that there's so much that we don't know and we need to be humble about.
It's so interesting. I mean, it's a dose of humility. But really, you're absolutely correct. The perspective changes so radically from reading the whole story, or the point of view of one of those characters. And what you said is absolutely true. In life, we really are one of those characters. We're a live witness. We don't know everything that came before or after and everything else. And thank you. I mean, it's a great reading. So I appreciate you sharing that.
And let me put it briefly into some really good context right now that I think resonates greatly. It's
Sure.
god awful that we're going through this kind of a pandemic, and the fact that we've lost the hundreds of thousands in this continent as well as the millions across the world. It's a tragedy that we've lost them. But there's a very perverse way of the deaths working themselves out in a weird way. That is to say that we are learning so much about this disease from, unfortunately, the corpses of those who had it. In fact, it's entirely possible, if not likely, that the vaccine or the medicine or the treatment or the whatever it is that comes to help either mitigate or eradicate this disease will come from the result of someone who died. And if I ultimately end up with a COVID vaccine in a few months in my arm, in a very weird way, a twisted way, I have to actually be grateful that whoever it was that produced that death died. Now, I don't actually take any great joy. I don't rejoice and say, yes, I'm so happy they died. But at the same time, I have to recognize that if that person or a group of people hadn't died, hadn't been able to give what they gave to the researchers to make whatever they did, I wouldn't be able to live with the vaccine that, God willing, will come one day. So while the person who's the father or the son or the whatever of the person who died will never feel like that person's death was justified, for lack of a better term, or that they deserved it, there is a bigger picture in which their death continues to actually have incredible impact long after they're gone. And though it's remarkably and even sometimes coldly utilitarian, their death serves a great purpose in the grand scheme of the world. That doesn't mean the manner of their death does. That doesn't mean that they were justified. It doesn't mean it was worth the pain. That's not where I'm going with it. But it also means that there's so much more to the death than just the loss of a human being, even though that's what we who are close to those human beings who are died most often focus on.
It's interesting. I mean, I remember thinking about this in philosophy classes in rabbinical school, and right, the question of why do bad things happen to good people, and one of those answers is to look at that larger picture, right? God's plan. Right, but I remember Rabbi Dorf would always remind us, right? This isn't what you tell somebody who's grieving, who's in that moment, right? This isn't what you tell someone who just suffered a loss. That is part of God's larger plan, or there's a greater good. And any of these things that we can discuss academically when we're sitting on the outside. But I think also in my own life, when I've met people that are grieving or had suffered a loss, I'd turn that into something for the good, right? They obviously would wish their loved one back if they had the power to, but being able to live on, whether it's through a foundation started for the values that their loved one lived for, or even on the smaller level, but the still a big level, but something that's more doable for most of us is living our own lives by the values that our loved ones live by, using their life as something that inspires us to continue to do good in the world in their name. It definitely is, I think, a source of comfort to many. Again, not in that moment of loss, but in their path forward, in the path of living and adjusting to it. So I think at the same time, as we move forward from this plague that's upon the world right now, looking at the things that have come out of it, besides the vaccines, the new technologies and the new modes of connecting and our better awareness and all sorts of other things, I think there is that way we can look on a more global level at the good that's coming from things. Anyway, I really love that text, and I want to thank you so much, Rabbi, for joining us. It's a treat to share your Torah, your thoughts, your story with my community here in Toronto. And thank you so much for being with us. Everyone at home watching, I want to thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week for another session of learning with my rabbis. It's a pleasure to share somebody that's impacted my life, my rabbinate, with my congregants. So thank you.
And thank you, Rabbi Sachs. It's a real joy to be able to see you in this rabbinic environment. You are doing great work in Toronto, and it's incredibly proud. I'm incredibly proud to have you as a friend and colleague.
Don't love God.
If you don't love your neighbor, if you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he gets